I'm Dr. Barry, licensed psychologist, and we are diving right into day 3 of the Miller hearing. So, I did a video covering day 4, covering the prosecution's expert. This is the defense expert, Dr. King. And someone specifically asked me to cover his talk about implicit bias and then also psychosis and some things he said. There are some trigger words for violence, for a lot of different mental health concerns. They do get a little graphic sometimes. And so that's your warning. If you need to hop off, I also have resources down in the description. I also have full links because this video is from Law and Crime and I have a full link. I'm just covering parts of this and providing more commentary and some psychoeducation on some of the topics that were covered.
Experiences. What did you come across when examining all of the evidence and discussing the matter with Mr. Crumbley?
Certainly, in my review of the records, I saw that as early as age 10, um, matter of fact, even going back to age 6, there were some issues. Um, I interviewed a neighbor, and looking at the records, which were corroborated, is that he was left unattended as early as age 6. He will go across to the neighbor's house, especially when there was like a thunder shower, and reported that he was afraid and would ask for help. And they would ask him where were his parents, and his response was, "I don't know."
And I don't know if Child Protective Services were ever involved because I know in my state, Virginia, a child being left home alone at 6 years old, that would be a reason to call. And maybe the family needs daycare. Maybe there are resources that the family needs, but the fact that he was left alone and didn't know where they were, that's where it gets into attachment for me because sometimes there can be this lack of attachment, this adults don't meet my needs, and that's where overly permissive parenting or parenting that's quite neglectful, you can see some behavioral issues in the kids. Not everybody will. So some people will go through that same situation and then become a social worker or go into the military or they'll do something else. But for some individuals, that early neglect, not that it necessarily causes something, but it kind of puts some building blocks in place where when we look back, we have some concerns early on. So let's keep going.
In the records at age 10, there's text messages between Ethan and his mom saying to her, "When are you going to come home?" And there were no responses. In my interview with Ethan, he explained that he spent countless hours watching various adult games. Um, some of them are in my report, and
And just because someone watches violent content or they play violent video games, that doesn't necessarily mean that it could cause issues later on. I am mindful of the warnings on certain things. So I have a 6-year-old and there are times where if he watches something, like he'll start to reenact, he'll replay, like he'll do some of the things that he's watching. So we are mindful of the ratings on things. Also with video games, we try to make sure to be mindful of those. Not every parent does that, and not every kid that plays that type of video game, like I said, it doesn't necessarily mean that they will definitely do crimes in the future. In this case, it does sound like it desensitized him to violence and maybe, like, he, ugh, might have had comfort or relief or gratification or that he got some pleasure out of watching those kinds of things, and that is troubling. That doesn't necessarily mean that he has a diagnosed mental health condition, which is what the expert from day 4 talks about, and so, let's go.
Assassin's Creed, Grand Theft Auto, and he also spent an inordinate amount of time going to different websites
Mhm.
and indulging in various graphic scenes, and indicated after a while he began to fantasize about being part of those scenes. So he sort of lost track of reality.
You also have listed trauma. What is trauma?
Trauma is sort of an insult to the person, an insult to the brain. So it could be as a result of parental discord. It could be as a result of high levels of anxiety or high levels of depression. Anything that insults the person's brain can be classified as trauma.
What about constant stress from parents fighting?
Yes, parental dysfunction, constant and intense dysfunction can induce trauma. In my interview with Ethan and in a review of the records also.
All right. So a little later, I don't know if I'm going to play that clip or not, but he talks about adverse childhood experiences and he makes up a number where he says that because he didn't give him the specific questions to answer. As a part of my intake with adults, I do give adults the adverse childhood experiences scale for them to just self rate for themselves what their ACEs is. He considered the parents not seeking medical treatment after an injury, he considered that to be physical trauma, and I I didn't, and experts can disagree. I'm not an expert, I'm not a forensic expert. I wouldn't have considered that under that particular thing because he's trying to say he has an ACEs between 6 to 8. That's what he's saying. So, if y'all have questions, let me know. We're gonna keep going.
There's frequent references to either parent threatening to commit suicide. And on some occasions, Ethan has had to be the one intervening at such a young age.
What about the loss of a grandparent or the loss of an animal, especially in a violent death?
Absolutely. Ethan disclosed that one of his sort of soulmate was a large dog that he cherished, and it died at home, and he was the one tasked with having to remove it and take it back to the shed and figure out how to dispose of it.
And you saw the Google searches where he actually is looking how to dispose of a dog that has passed away. Is that correct?
Yes, ma'am, that is correct.
What about the loss of a best friend?
Um, the loss of a best friend and perhaps your only friend is could be a pretty traumatic experience, as in the case of Ethan, and as seen in the record, he spent hours and hours communicating with his best friend and pouring out his heart and disclosing what was happening to him.
Were you also told what his mother told him when that friend went away to a rehab?
Yes, ma'am.
And what was that?
She told him that he would probably never see his friend again.
Let's move on. Dr. Keating, when he testified last week, touched on ACEs. Can you explain what that is to the court?
Yes, so I think in 1995 and 97, my year could be off. The CDC and Kaiser commissioned.
So I already went into that a little bit, and he also mentions feral child and does this experiment where he explains trauma, the plasticity of the brain, and how easily the brain can be damaged using this demonstration with an egg. So I'm going to jump ahead to where the prosecutor was cross-examining him and really digging deep. A bunch of stuff came up about his report and things not matching, some things being exactly the same, a few sentences being exactly the same as someone else's report. And sometimes people do use templates, but that some things that were in the other report didn't necessarily apply from the prosecutor's stance, didn't apply to Ethan's case. And So I'm going to jump ahead to where the prosecutor is challenging some of his statements.
Uh, You know, the Miller factors are incorporated into Michigan law. Are you aware of that?
Yes, sir.
Okay, and can you tell us what the 5 factors are?
So, immaturity, age, person has to be younger than 18. Impetuosity, transient recklessness, and ability to extricate oneself from a dysfunctional family.
And so they quickly just went over what the Miller factors were because this is a hearing to determine whether or not he's able to get life in prison. And the unique thing about this is the judge is the one that's going to be making this determination and not a jury. I've seen some, not for a Miller case, but sometimes not for a Miller case, but for some other situations for sentencing where they were saying what they thought and the jury was the one that ultimately got to decide. Well, this is where the judge is going to be the one that decides some of this. And so,
Anything else, doctor?
I probably missed a couple. I didn't memorize them.
Okay, so doctor, in fact, under the law, there are 5 factors. First is chronological age, hallmark features among them, immaturity, impetuosity, failure to appreciate risks and consequences. Does that sound right?
That's about right.
So most of what you described goes to that first factor. The second is the juvenile's family and home environment. And you talked about that, the inability to overcome his circumstances, right?
Yes, sir.
There are 3 other factors: the circumstance of the homicide offense, the incompetencies of youth, which affect how the juvenile might have been charged or convicted of a lesser crime, and the possibility of rehabilitation, correct?
Yes, sir.
All right. Doctor, when were you retained in this case?
I think I was contacted on or around, and my timeline could be off. I want to say in November. It was just around Thanksgiving of 22, I believe. Again, my timeline could be off.
And you were provided some materials to review,
Yes, sir.
and then you interviewed the defendant.
I did.
Over how many sessions?
I believe over 6 sessions.
And can you tell us when those were?
Sorry, I did not memorize the date. I think the first time I met the defendant would have been around January 4th or 5th. I think that is the first time I interviewed him.
and so some things come up where some things that the prosecutor is asking, you would think it would be in the report. So typically you would write down the dates of the evaluation, the dates that you met with the person. I do psychological testing and I typically meet with somebody on the first time, just getting a history. And then the next time I do testing, there have been times where testing wasn't able to be completed all in one day. And so I'll note if it was over multiple sessions, if we had to come back and follow up with anything. But I don't think those specific dates were in the report.
I interviewed him twice virtually, and maybe 3 or 4 times after the last time I interviewed him.
Maybe though. So like this, okay, I'll keep going.
Was probably July, I think 10th or 11th. I don't have the access to my calendar, so I didn't memorize those dates.
Hey, Doctor, what do you have with you today? Before you move on, the first meeting you said that was on January 4th or January 5th, was that of 2023?
Yes, sir.
Thank you. And then your last meeting, of course, would have been in 2023 as well, sir.
Yes, sir.
Thank you. You may proceed.
Thank you. Doctor, what do you have with you today?
So, anytime an expert comes into court, anything they bring up to the stand with them, it can be admitted as evidence. And so, often people will be very mindful about what they bring onto the stand. That happened in the Letitia case. I think the one expert brought up notes, brought up a bunch of different stuff, and they wanted all of that to be admitted, especially because she was referencing those things. And anything that you're referencing, anything that you bring up, it can be brought into the case. So this, it turns out that the report that he has, their dates that are off, I'm going to skip forward to get to the part where they talk about ACEs. Let me check the time.
Physical abuse?
That is debatable.
Okay, so doctor, can you, as you sit here today, can you tell the court that in fact this defendant has a score of 6 or higher on ACEs?
Absolutely.
All right, so you can score him on ACEs right now.
100%.
Okay, let's do that. Take me through the testing, take me through the 10 questions, and let's talk about his score.
So I don't have the question in front of me, but I can ask some of the questions to get the information to that question. I'll be happy to walk you through.
Okay, please.
Okay. You want to ask about,
Doctor, so we're clear. I don't care what you want to ask about. I want you to tell me the defendant's ACEs score.
So you can tell the prosecutor is trying to challenge his credibility and his findings and how he's coming to the things that he's saying, because they're going to talk about subjective versus objective data, because a lot of what Dr. King is basing the opinion on, it's based on self-report measures. So even though the MMPI, it does have validity measures, it's still the client's report of their experience. There are specific tests that you can give that do get at malingering. I don't know that any of those, because there were 15 tests, I believe, that were given, but it's spec depression. Like there are a bunch of different self-report measures along with IQ testing and achievement testing. But yeah.
That's what I want to know. You said you didn't do it, you didn't need to, but now I want to know what his score is.
so I was very clear with you that I administered 15 tests. And I said I did not administer the ACEs. I was very clear about that.
You did, and then you just told me you could do it right now.
I said I can give him an ACEs score based on the 15 tests that I administered.
All right, doctor. So why don't you give me his ACEs score based on the 15 tests you administered?
So his score would probably range somewhere between 6 to about 8.
And that's based on the other tests that you gave him.
Yes, sir.
And that's not anywhere in your report. You agree?
I did not administer the ACEs.
Doctor, on page 6 of your report,
Before we get too far from this issue, there was something I wanted to clear up. When the prosecutor asked you about physical abuse, your answer was debatable. What did you mean by that?
Sir, if a child is injured and the parent does not take action, that is considered physical abuse.
I'm going to Google
When
that.
Ethan fell in the diner and hit his head, and the owner
So I see that more as medical neglect. I wouldn't see that as physical. Now, I have seen where a parent that makes a child run sprints for 8 hours or something, where and the child ends up, I don't know, just dehydrated, or there's some type of thing that happens, or if the parent had pushed the child and that was what caused the injury. But for me personally, I would consider that more medical neglect. I wouldn't necessarily call that physical. We'll keep going.
said, I need to call 911 and didn't, I consider that physical abuse.
all right. So
Before you move on, is that the only thing that you consider as physical abuse as it relates directly to this defendant?
Additionally, when Ethan was with his parents and fell again and reported a loss of consciousness and was not taken to seek medical attention, I also consider that to be physical abuse.
Thank you. People, you may continue.
thank you, Your Honor. On page 6, doctor, in the last sentence of
If you're an expert and the judge is asking you clarifying questions, that means that things are not coming across clearly. Now, I can see some things that this expert is saying. I also thought there might have been some depression and things before this date. Things come out during this trial, during this particular hearing that I wasn't aware of. I don't watch the things like the manifesto, or I don't, so I have not followed this case everything with it. And so during my last video, I mentioned that the school had asked them to take him home. And I guess because somebody commented that that didn't happen, so y'all can research that. But the school did require he within 48 hours, the school did say he had to have some type of treatment. And I do believe the school would have followed up with Child Protective Services if they hadn't gotten him into some type of treatment. And then the fact that he acted on those things before that, I think that's where the other expert thought that this was a lot more planned. He had a lot of control over this. This wasn't some impulsive thing. There was a lot of thought and planning that went into everything. And so that's why that expert thought he didn't have this psychosis, this break from reality where he wasn't in control of his behavior, that he didn't understand that what he was doing was wrong. I guess there were some journal entries as well about him like wanting to like with young kids wanting to cut their lives short, and that was extremely troubling to hear. And so there were definitely some major red flags. I guess that poor friend, whoever that friend is, I hope that they got their own help and support. And so that's where I tell clients, if there is a friend that is messaging you things that are concerning, there's a difference between reporting and snitching. So snitching is we both get in trouble and I tell on you, so I get in less trouble. That's snitching. But reporting is my friend is in trouble. Like they're saying some things, they are not okay. I think even if even if I can anonymously share that information, I think ugh, because bringing safe adults into that mix, because I think telling the parents doesn't sound like that would have helped. Just based on some of their reactions, what from what has been reported, based on some of their reactions to the concerning things he was doing. Let's keep going.
Exposure to violent scenes, you make the statement, quote, "This mentality is typical of persons who spend an inordinate amount of time ingesting violent content." You see that?
Page 6, what paragraph?
It's the last sentence under exposure to violent scenes.
Yes, sir.
Doc, you don't cite anything for that, do you?
I don't know that
There's
you
no
would have to.
citation here.
Okay, what do you base that on?
That's a good question.
I base it on my clinical experience, sir.
Doctor, I mean, that's been studied, hasn't it?
It has.
It's been largely debunked, isn't that true?
That is not true.
Okay, can you cite me anything?
So
Any literature that substantiates that?
I'm happy to respond. So it's hotly debated as to whether if one is exposed to frequent scenes of violence and carnage, if that exposure has an adverse effect on that child. Some experts say no, and some experts say yes.
So I think it depends on the child. And that's what I was saying earlier, that just because this happens, there's not, it won't be that way for all children. Now, when they did a study, so it was the Bobo doll. I think I learned that in social psychology, like in one of my classes, where they had the children play with a blow up clown, and the kids really didn't do anything violent. Like kids just played normally with the clown. But then with another group of kids, they showed them a video of somebody hitting the clown. And then they put them in the room with the clown, and the kids were more likely to do, but that was like an exact. They they saw this and then they were put in that situation. It's like, oh, this is what you do with that. And so that might be some of the research that he's thinking about. But when you actually research kids that play violent video games, or when you research some of those things, there is not always that one-to-one issue. If I'm working with clients on an outpatient basis and if they are struggling with managing aggression, with managing their impulses, with doing those things, we try to find other outlets, other ways, because just so that they're not practicing or fantasizing about this type of scenario.
I can cite you Eric Erickson, developmental psychologist, who chronicles that between the ages of 0 to 5, a child learns most of his core values in
He's coming across to me like he's frustrated with the questions as well. And I think he's trying to just remain as the expert and to come across in a certain way. Towards the end, he's just like, fine, I'll agree with you." And and I think he was on the stand for probably 5.5 hours. On and off because they took breaks, but I do think it was a long testimony. So
fact, children absorb what they observe.
So doctor, thank you for that answer, but the defendant's playing of video games actually post dates this thinking, right? He reports having violent thoughts long before he played any of those video games. Isn't that true?
That is true.
Okay, so you can't have cause and effect where the violent thoughts are caused by the video games he played later. Would you agree with me?
Can you rephrase that question, please?
the funny thing, not but like, so when he asked him to rephrase the question, because to me, rephrase means say it in a different way. The prosecutor often just repeats the question, and often he answers it when he just repeats the question.
Having violent thoughts at age 5 or 6, and he plays video games at age 13, you would agree with me, the video games didn't cause the thoughts.
Sure didn't make them better.
Okay, so you're saying a person who already had violent thoughts was urged on by the video games he was watching.
What I am saying is that at age 6, if you're having aberrant thoughts and you engage yourself in frequent exposure to video games, it's not going to make you a better person.
We can agree on that, doctor.
Thank you.
All right, doctor, on page 7, you talk about mental illness, correct?
Yes, sir.
And you cite the statutory definition of mental illness, and you also reference something you refer to as, quote, the Miller factor. Do you see that?
Yes, sir.
Doctor, which Miller factor are you referring to?
The Miller factor of 2012, or the Miller hearing of 2012.
So, doctor, we walked through at the start of your testimony what the 5 Miller factors are from the United States Supreme Court. There are 5 of them. And what I'm asking you is, when you say in the last line of the first paragraph under evidence of mental illness, you say, taking into consideration certain factors known as, quote, the Miller factor. And what I'm saying is, when you're talking about mental illness, which Miller factor are you talking about?
The inability to extricate oneself from a dysfunctional family.
All right, so you're saying the second, his family and home life, is where you would put mental illness.
Family and home life. Yes, sir.
Doctor, you say that the defendant, and this is in the last full paragraph on page 7, that the defendant is without question someone who is mentally ill. You see that?
Yes, sir.
And you base that on the text messages that you cite in the pages following and some testing you did, correct?
I based that on my clinical interviews. I based that on my testing using objective testing methods.
So I just want you to look at the sentence that follows that. It says, a review of his verbalization through text messages and psychological testing substantiate this assertion, right?
Yes, sir.
And then you referenced a group of roughly 200 text messages, correct?
Yes, sir.
Doctor, the statutory definition of mental illness in criminal law relates to the question of criminal responsibility. Are you familiar with that?
Yes, sir.
Have you testified previously about criminal responsibility?
I have.
All right. And that has to do with whether the defendant has a viable insanity defense, true?
That is correct.
Doctor, you reviewed Dr. Anaker's report, correct?
I did.
And would you agree with me that it's a very thorough report?
I do not.
Okay, what's missing?
I looked at Dr. Anica's report, and in all of my years of testing, and this is, of course, no disrespect meant, sir. I'm just giving a factual response to your question. Not one testing was done in Dr. Anica's report. In Dr. Anica's report, Ethan expressed hearing voices.
Okay. So he is a clinical psychologist, and Dr. Anniker, I did that video on her testimony. She is a forensic psychiatrist. And so, psychologists, we love our testing. That's what makes a psychologist different from a social worker or a licensed professional counselor. Psychologists, we are trained to do psychological testing. School psychologists do the psychoeducational testing in the school systems. Psychologists, we love our test. And I had mentioned that for a few other experts. It's like they didn't do any tests. But I saw Dr. Anniker's, like, I saw her testimony, and it sounds like she didn't just take his word for it. When he said he was hearing voices, she tried to dig deeper. If he endorsed having delusions or thoughts that were out there, she dug deeper into, okay, what does that mean to him? Because I've had people say that they're having panic attacks. And when we check in and dig deeper, we realize, oh, they're actually having very strong anxiety attacks, but it's not quite a panic attack because it's anxiety attacks that are lasting for 5 to 6 hours, or like it's extremely distressful. It's incredibly troubling. But just because a client, and not to in any way invalidate what the client is experiencing, but the psychologist or psychiatrist, they have to know, does this fit with the DSM definition of this symptom? We'll keep going.
And seeing things. In Dr. Anica's report, Ethan said that at age 6, he went up to the preschool person, and this is what he said: "Wouldn't it be cool if cars can just crash into this school and kill?"
That sounds like a fantasy to me, or like I don't know that that would be psychosis. I don't know. Because so my son has sometimes said he sometimes has some catastrophic thinking. So sometimes he might say something like, "Ooh, what if, this happened?" But it's not within the means of, yeah, it's not uh, uh, okay.
Kill a lot of people? And the person said, then why would you say that? That is referenced in Dr. Anica's report, sir.
Right, it is, exactly. Why is that a problem or something missing in her report?
So to conclude that such a person does not have mental illness is striking.
All right, so doctor, other than the absence of testing, anything else that you where you disagree with that it's a thorough report?
It is not, sir.
Outside of the testing, what else do you think is missing?
So to diagnose someone with mental illness, there's 3 ways to do that.
And I think he's going to list 4, but it's okay. Coming off top of your head is hard.
You look at the brain,
Which you did not do, correct?
I did not do.
Correct.
You test the brain,
Correct.
which I did, times 15.
Okay.
Then you use cluster of symptoms using the DSM. That is the Bible or the Quran for psychologists.
And so it was actually made by psychiatrists. And so psychiatrists also use the DSM. I think she did reference, I don't think she talked about, I could be wrong. It was long. I think it was like 3.5 hours or something. This is hard.
There is no evidence that that was done. And then the 4th way, which most people do, is to guess. I did not see 1, 2, 3.
Okay, doctor,
So he is saying that she guessed. I missed that the first time I saw it. And to me, I think she did a very thorough clinical interview. And although she did not give him tests, she did try to look at that collateral information, and he did as well. Whoa.
You both didn't test the brain, right?
I'm sorry?
Neither of you tested the brain. You've agreed with that. You didn't give him an MRI. Neither of you did. Neither you nor Dr. Aneker tested the brain.
No, that is not true.
I'm sorry, imaged the brain.
Thank you. I did
Okay,
not.
So number one, neither of you did number one.
That is
And,
correct.
and your testimony is you did number two. You gave him 15 tests, right? And you're saying Dr. Aneker did not.
It was
right.
not evident in the report.
Okay. And you're testifying that the third method is to look at the reported symptoms, correct?
Yes, sir.
And in fact, that's exactly what Dr. Aneker did. She included that. She just disagreed with your conclusion, right? She didn't deny he had symptoms.
I don't think that's true, sir.
You just referenced her talking about this report to the person on the playground at the school, right? She included that, right?
Her conclusion was that he's not mentally ill.
That's right, doctor. In fact, she cites all the text message and many more than you do that when he talks about, I have hallucinations, right? She includes that in her report. Would you agree with me?
He did.
Okay, so what I'm trying to get at, doctor, is I asked you if it's a very thorough report. You said no. You said she didn't do testing. And I'm asking you, what else do you think was not in her report that makes it not complete or thorough?
Looking at cluster of symptoms, looking at the DSM, and based on the guidelines of the DSM, which is a diagnostic and statistical manual.
So I think the biggest difference is that he is taking his word for it. When Ethan says he's hearing voices, like he's saying, okay, he's check hallucinations. Often I ask additional questions about, okay, what does it sound like? What does it say? Is it command? Like, are they telling you to do things? Is it just background? Like, I would want to ask more questions. He's going to talk later. I don't know that I'm going to show it from the Beck depression inventory and some other things where he endorsed these symptoms and he didn't ask follow up about, because I think he endorsed having remorse or grief, I don't know, being upset about something he had done. And he was assuming what he was referring to. In a situation like this, I do think you have to follow up on some of those questions, especially if you're going to hold up on cross examination. Let's go on ahead and skip ahead to the psychosis statement. Let's skip ahead.
Doctor, you testified that you have seen the defendant recently, or at least during your testing, and that you agree he is competent to stand trial.
I did.
Okay. Doctor, you replayed the jail camera video, right? That you discussed where the defendant is showing signs of distress and upset, and I think you say psychosis, right?
Yes, sir.
Doctor, the prosecution brought that to your attention, to the defense attention, right? We're the ones who said this is concerning behavior, right?
That is correct.
All right, and you then reviewed that, didn't you?
That is correct.
And you consulted with counsel and you were asked your opinion, right?
That is correct.
About whether this person was psychotic or competent and able to proceed with this hearing, right?
That is correct.
And you said he is, right?
Yes, sir.
You also would agree with me that that behavior comes after the defendant had been in the jail in a one-person cell for 16 months.
That is correct.
And you would agree with me that the defendant was not behaving that way right before, during, or after the shooting. You'd agree with me. Okay. Would you agree with that?
I don't have evidence otherwise, so yes.
Okay. He wasn't behaving that way when you interviewed him, right?
He was not.
He hasn't been behaving that way during this hearing, right?
That is correct.
And so this is the only incident you're aware of where the defendant exhibited that kind of behavior.
Can you rephrase that question, please, sir?
This is the only incident you're aware of where the defendant has exhibited that kind of behavior.
Are you referencing those 5 videos?
I'm referencing, yes. Are you aware those are all from the same incident, all from one date?
I'm not sure.
Okay, I'm gonna tell you that they are, but what I'm asking you, outside of those 5 videos, are you aware of any other instance where the defendant was behaving like that or showing those symptoms?
Actually, I am.
Okay,
There are serious concerns about suicidal ideation, which is why he was on suicidal watch.
so doctor, those were instances where he had something in his cell, might be trying to tie it to a speaker. He said he wasn't suicidal, but they were concerned, right?
That is correct.
There were a few times when they thought he needed to be observed constantly because he showed concerns about suicide, right?
That is correct.
That's not the same as psychosis, is it?
Actually, for one to try to harm themselves is an expression of mental illness.
I asked you about psychosis, doctor,
Psychosis means a break from reality.
right? And someone thinking about killing themselves is not broken from reality, are they?
Yes, sir.
All right, so you're saying thoughts of suicide are a symptom of psychosis. That's your opinion. That's the testimony you're offering to the court today.
I am.
So, doctor, in the video,
Okay. So major depression, severe. Within the DSM-5, it says with psychosis or without. And I hear the statement about those types of thoughts being a break from reality, but to say that just having those thoughts is psychosis, to me, that so I work with a lot of people that have those kinds of thoughts, and they do not have psychosis. They do not hear things, they don't see things. That often when I think of psychosis, I think of altered reality, altered states of mind, altered states of being. And when I think about those intense thoughts, those SI type thoughts, I think of those as more just intense pain. Often it's when the depression, when all those things are getting unbearable, or something unexpected happens, or there's a major loss, or there are lots of times that an individual might get those kinds of thoughts, and there are ways to treat it. There are safe ways. I try to avoid hospitalization if I can, if individuals can safely be kept within the home. Um, but and there are CAMS. Let me look that up and share that resource real quick. So CAMS is the Collaborative Assessment and Manage of Suicidality, and that it is research based and it has been shown to be really effective. There are ways to find a clinician, and I'll make sure to link this in the description. But to say that just having those types of thoughts equals psychosis, that's a step further than I'm willing to go. And that was something that a subscriber asked me to specifically talk about. That no, those two things are not the same. There are people that have psychosis and they don't have suicidal or homicidal thoughts. There are people that have those kinds of thoughts that don't have psychosis. And so that those are typically thought as different things. It's interesting how all of these trials that get televised, that especially when experts, when they're have able to look back and have their testimony kind of critiqued in this way, because I've given some testimony and I'm thankful that it wasn't recorded. Not I didn't say or do anything wrong. It's just to have other people, because when you're on the stand, you're doing the best that you can. And so I do want to give a little grace for that. And at the same time, I also want to say, because this is just such a public thing, I like to clarify where I stand on certain things and share resources and tips and education on those topics. Let's keep going. I'm going to skip ahead to that bias part, because implicit bias.
I'm sorry, sir.
you're not offering a fix for a broken brain,
No, sir.
okay? And you're not telling the court even that it can be fixed, are you?
Yes, I am actually.
Okay, you know that this can be fixed.
Yes, sir.
All right. Doctor, you finished that sentence on page 40, describing the defendant as a person waiting for something terrible. That's in the third to last sentence in the last full paragraph on page 40.
The third to last sentence.
in the last full paragraph. So it's the paragraph under summary of defendant's mental illness.
Okay.
And you say broken person with a broken brain waiting for something terrible to happen. Do you see that?
Yes, sir.
Doctor, he wasn't waiting, was he?
He was.
He was planning. Wasn't he planning something terrible?
He was.
And he planned it out and he wrote about it and he recorded himself talking about it. And he actually anticipated people finding his recordings, right?
Yes, sir.
And then he carried out something terrible, right?
Yes, sir.
You make another remarkable statement on the last line, in the last full paragraph of page 40. Quote, the
And before we get into the unconscious bias, I also want to share, because I don't know if I've already passed the section where they talked about the fact that he didn't want to die by that way, and that he didn't think he would be remembered, and that this was a way to and so that's where, when things like that happen, when people are doing it for fame or infamy or any of that, like that's just that's so troubling. And with all the things that the prosecution brought out today with this expert, I understand more why the second expert has her opinion. I still do think that there was some depression, but maybe it didn't meet the legal mental health, where this mental health concern impacted their ability to know right from wrong. That legal definition of insanity or mental impairment, that I could get that. It definitely does sound like there was some issues, some things there. And then also, I've said it a few times, some conduct disorder or antisocial type traits as well.
defendant's form of mental illness, if not treated, typically ends with deadly consequences. Do you see that?
Yes, sir.
You don't cite anything to support that in your report, do you?
It's not cited in my report, sir. That is correct.
Okay, what do you base that on? The idea that the defendant's form of mental illness, as you describe it, typically ends with deadly consequences.
Yes, sir.
Can you cite?
And I think the prosecution, their issue with that is there are people that have major depression, severe, with psychotic features, that don't do what he did. And they're going to go over the numbers. I guess there have only been 16, I think, kids under the age of 18 that have done what he's done, with more than 4. Like they had a certain threshold that they covered, because there were more than 16 total, but just for it to reach that mass number. And wow.
Court, what you rely on for that prospect?
Every day in this country, I'm citing it. I'm giving you the evidence, sir. 22 veterans killed themselves.
Doctor, that's not the question. You use the word typically, and you use the mental illness describing this defendant. And what I'm asking you is, where do you get that it typically ends in deadly consequence?
He's not going to be able to answer that. Let's just skip ahead a little bit, because that veteran thing was a little triggering for me. I work with a lot of veterans and really appreciate, yeah.
And say, you and I agree that implicit bias exists, and it's been widely studied and well documented. And I know you teach seminars on it, and I agree with you that it's an important issue. What I don't understand is how implicit bias has anything to do with this case. So that's what I want to focus on, okay? What was the
Because he's pretty much saying, because Ethan is a white male, that they didn't search him, that they didn't do all those things, and that somehow failed him, like that somehow that implicit bias was a major factor in this, despite the fact that when you look at people, mass pew pews, that a lot of it is um white men. Now there have been others, so like especially within the last like 2-3 years, there have been sadly that dynamic has been getting more diverse. And when I say sadly, I'm just talking about, I wish they didn't happen at all. I wish we had supports and ways, and when people are disgruntled, or when they're just angry at society in this way, or because really there are some platforms that can radicalize people and make them at risk to do some of these things. And so let's keep going.
genesis of this idea of yours to view this shooter and this shooting through the lens of race?
So what I do when I teach implicit bias classes, sir,
So doctor, I want to stop you. My specific question is, what was the genesis of this idea that you have to view this shooter and this shooting through the lens of race?
I was about to explain it to you, sir.
Let me ask you this. Was that your idea or someone else's?
Who's his?
It's actually based on my profession, on my professional experience, sir.
All right, so this was your idea.
It's not solely my idea, sir.
No, what I mean is, when you decided to put that in your report, no one said to you, hey, doctor, how about implicit bias? You came to them and said, you know what, I can explain this, it's implicit bias. True? It's your idea.
No, sir.
Who involved in this case said to you, how about implicit bias?
I got my information by looking at the data and by disaggregating the data, sir.
I'm not talking about the data that you rely on. I'm talking about the idea. Have you ever seen another mitigation report that blames a defendant's conduct on implicit bias?
I have not.
Okay, and what I'm saying is, so you have this idea, right?
Okay.
And where did that come from?
From my professional training and my research and teaching on implicit bias.
So doctor, on page 44, you refer to implicit bias as, quote, perhaps the most telling variable that contributed to the tragic events that can be traced. Pardon me. The most telling variable that contributed to the tragic events can be traced to implicit bias. You see that?
And before I said that, I would have said the parents' inability to meet, or from what's been reported, from what I've seen, the parents' alleged neglect. I would have said a host of other things. I wouldn't have even listed implicit bias because that's, ooh, I guess he was saying if he had been a marginalized, so if he had been Black or Hispanic, that they would have searched the bag. I guess that's what he's saying. Despite the fact that there was in Virginia, so we had the elementary school issue where a student, they had told administration, people were saying, we saw it. We know that, like, people are reporting that they've seen it on the child. And this was a little African American child. That child's mom, I believe, was charged with not securing that weapon. But I don't see how implicit bias plays ah, a major factor. Now, that really is a stretch. That really is a stretch. I think he wasn't a problem. I think he wasn't on their radar in that way. He didn't get into fights, so they weren't suspecting like substances. I don't think they ever thought that he would have it at school. And the idea to search, I don't think they even thought of that. Often in schools, I know in Virginia, the SRO, so sometimes there are limits to what schools can do as far as searching students, and there has to be some significant probable or like a reason to do so. But I wonder if if that particular school is open. I know our middle and high schools, they instituted what is it? Metal detectors. And I guess there's some AI that's supposed to detect like if somebody has something on them, but implicit bias. From my perspective, I don't see how that played a major role in this.
I don't see it, but I do agree.
It's the first sentence on page 44 under implicit bias and failure to act.
Just one moment, sir. Okay.
What do you mean by the most telling variable? You know what, let's make this faster. What are the other variables that are not as telling?
Explicit bias did not seem to be a factor. That is one variable that did not seem to be.
Hold on, doctor. I'm talking about variables in this case. You're talking about the most telling variable in this case. You say that contributed to the tragic events. You're talking about the shooting in this case, correct?
Yes, sir.
I want to know the variables you're talking about in this case for which implicit bias is the most telling. What are the other variables related to this case?
I don't have others.
It's the only variable?
That's what I looked at, sir.
And that's where I don't know if he was fully hearing the question, because I would have said the parents, you know, and not even fully knowing everything about this case. I definitely do think there were some other factors and variables. So to put it all on implicit bias, that was interesting.
So you don't look at parental neglect or his home life as one of the most telling variables?
They were all contributing factors.
Or the untreated mental illness, or you claim untreated mental illness that according to you typically ends with the defendant killing someone? That's not the most telling variable to you?
They're all contributing factors.
All right. You say multiple times in your report that the defendant needed and was asking for help and he didn't get it, right? That's according to you.
Yes, sir.
And the people you say that he didn't get it from his parents, and then you told me the school, right?
Yes, sir.
Does implicit bias have anything to do with his parents' failure to get him help?
I'm sorry?
Does implicit bias have anything to do with his parents' failure to get him help?
I don't think so.
Okay, so you're just talking about the school.
Yes, sir.
All right.
So he's going to go deeper into how the school did try to help, how everybody that was impacted was European American, that there wasn't this race-based attack or anything that he did, and so that was not a factor or an issue. And so I'm going to skip ahead because there was another part that talks about using somebody else's formatting and language. And that was, that was,
Sir, my report is 70 pages and this report is 12 pages. My report has 15 psychological tests and this report has none.
So doctor, I think your answer is you can't tell me right now as you sit here which parts you took from Dr.
Correct.
Holden's report. Okay. Doctor, when did you find out that I knew you had taken portions of someone else's report? When did you learn that?
Actually through the attorney who retained me.
Okay. And they alerted you. They said, hey, the prosecutor's office is asking for Dr. Holden's report, and I think there's something up.
I don't know what I know about Ethan's attorney who retained me.
Okay. They brought you the report and said, hey, or they said to you, there's an issue here, right? You didn't bring it to them.
So you keep saying they, sir. I can only tell you one person that I had a conversation with.
Okay.
And that is Paulette Lofton.
Okay. About this report, and it's not you told her, it's she told you.
Correct.
Okay.
and so I guess there was some exact language that was pulled. And I don't know what additional forensic training that he did. So if I was doing forensic assessments or evaluations, and there are lots of people that do them and they don't get the forensic certification, I highly recommend, if you want to get into expert testimony, I think it's really important to take that additional forensic education, because learning the law, learning all of those things and how you as the expert, the role that you have, and just the recommendations and tips that they have, especially as a psychologist or psychiatrist, whatever profession it is. But doing that additional work, I think that can really help, because the other side is always going to try to push your buttons. They're going to try to make you not look as credible. And I think he likely did a very good report. I think he did rely a lot on Ethan's self-report. And when we talk about objective versus subjective, subjective is what the client says. And then, that's just how we look at it. And then objective is, collateral information, or the therapist then, or psychologist, psychiatrist digging deeper to find, okay, we're going to watch the videos, we're going to do all these different things. It came up in some of the testimony that he didn't watch some of the videos. I think he indicated that he thought Ethan was crying at one point. The prosecutor definitely disagrees with that. He did not believe, he thought he was just sitting quietly. The fact that he just turned himself in, that he did not want to die, I think all of those things definitely played a factor and a role. And I think there's a way to balance everything. And the testimony, it came across in a way that it wasn't nearly as bad as a few others that have gotten quite a few views on my channel. Not nearly that level, but I understood why somebody wanted me to say, "Hey, can you talk about that implicit bias? Can you talk about the psychosis thing?" Because what did you think about that? I definitely understand why people wanted to see that. And so if you made it this far, thank you so much for watching. I truly appreciate y'all's support. If y'all see things that y'all want me to cover, or if y'all want a different part, I believe they come back on the 29th. And I think the judge is likely going to make a sentencing statement like some of the other judges have done. I really enjoy reacting to those things as well. Depending on what time it is, I might be able to do it live, uh, but it just depends. So once I figure out what time it's supposed to come out, I might be able to go live on the 29th. If not, I'll definitely have something prepared by the 30th, possibly later that night. We'll see. But I hope you enjoy the rest of your day.